Before the war in Ukraine, before rising tensions in the South China Sea, before the talk of a new Cold War, there was Korea, a conflict where America underestimated China, misread its intentions, and paid the price. What happened in 1950 isn't just history, it's a warning, a lesson in how quickly a local conflict can become a global crisis, and how one wrong assumption can change the world. This story is relevant today because the same mistake could happen again. The victory America expected. In the summer of 1950, America believed it already understood this war. North Korea had surged across the 38th parallel and nearly swallowed the South. But the United States, fresh from the triumph of World War II, answered with the full confidence of a nation that had saved the world just 5 years earlier. The early months felt familiar. American troops, alongside UN forces, pushed back the North Korean army with speed and precision. The Battle of Pusan perimeter held. The Incheon landing, General MacArthur's daring amphibious assault, became an instant legend. North Korean forces collapsed in weeks, retreating so fast that US commanders felt they were watching a replay of past victories. It was intoxicating, it was misleading, and it created the most dangerous illusion a superpower can fall into: the belief that the war was already won. Reports from the front were triumphant. Press conferences in Washington spoke confidently of home by Christmas. Generals briefed that the enemy was shattered, demoralized, incapable of recovery. MacArthur insisted that the United States should not merely stop North Korea, it should eliminate it entirely. The mood in the Pentagon was almost celebratory. This wasn't Europe. This wasn't a global war. This was a small conflict in a small peninsula, battered by a small army. America, with its tanks, planes, and atomic-era power, felt utterly secure. To US leaders, advancing north looked like the natural conclusion, a clean end to an untidy war. So the objective shifted: not just repel North Korea, crush it, march all the way to the Yalu River, unify the peninsula under an American-backed government, deliver a victory so complete that communism would think twice before challenging US power again. But beneath the excitement, there were warning signs. Chinese intelligence had begun to monitor the front closely. Ambiguous troop movements stirred along the Yalu River. Foreign diplomats hinted that Beijing would not tolerate American troops on its border. Even the Indian ambassador, one of the world's most respected intermediaries, warned Washington that China would intervene if provoked. But America did not believe it. The early victories had created a blinding confidence, a belief that nothing, not terrain, not weather, not geopolitics, could derail the momentum. In the glow of early triumph, America made the same mistake that empires have made for thousands of years, confusing a breakthrough for a conclusion. The United States thought it was finishing the war. In truth, it was walking straight into its beginning. The warnings everyone ignored. Long before the first Chinese soldier fired a shot, Beijing warned the world exactly what it intended to do. But the United States, convinced of its own momentum, believed these warnings were bluff, propaganda, posturing. The truth was far more dangerous. In October 1950, as UN forces surged northward toward the Yalu River, China issued statement after statement declaring that its security was at risk. Newspapers in Beijing printed headlines saying the People's Republic would not tolerate foreign armies at its doorstep. Chinese diplomats repeated the message in Delhi, Moscow, London, and Washington. If American troops crossed into North Korea's northern provinces, China would respond. But the US State Department dismissed the language as political theater. They believed China was too weak, too divided, too exhausted from its recent civil war to intervene. A nation that had just fought for years against Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists surely had no appetite for a war against the world's greatest power. General MacArthur, charismatic, brilliant, and dangerously confident, said China's warnings were a hollow threat. He insisted that Beijing would never risk open conflict with the United States, not when American air power could flatten cities within hours. His certainty became Washington's certainty. But reality was shifting beneath their feet. Chinese intelligence networks reported every UN movement. Korean refugees whispered to reporters that Chinese officers were already present in the mountains. Soviet advisors sent encrypted messages to Moscow describing troop concentrations near the Yalu. On October 15, even Mao Zedong issued a direct warning to India's prime minister, stating that if American soldiers crossed certain thresholds, China would not stand idly by. Washington received that message, and still, it marched forward. Part of the blindness was arrogance. Part was wishful thinking. Part was the belief, deeply rooted in the American psyche after World War II, that no nation would dare challenge its might. But another part was strategic calculation. If China wasn't bluffing, then the entire UN advance could turn catastrophic. Better to assume they were bluffing than face the terrifying alternative. So the warnings piled up, ignored and dismissed. Bridges were bombed near the border. Villages were shelled. UN troops crossed mountains within sight of Chinese territory, and as American soldiers advanced deeper into northern Korea, they began to notice something unsettling. Enemy forces weren't resisting. Villages were empty. Roads were abandoned. It felt too easy, too quiet, too calm. Only later would they understand the truth. The Chinese were not retreating. They were gathering, and the silence wasn't safety. It was the sound of an approaching storm, the dash to the Yalu. By November 1950, US and UN forces were racing north with a confidence that felt unstoppable. The North Korean army was shattered, its leadership fleeing, its defenses collapsing. American troops pushed past Pyongyang, past mountain ridges, past villages hollowed by retreat. They were no longer fighting a war, they were finishing one. The new objective was simple: reach the Yalu River, the border with China, end the conflict before winter, reunify Korea, return home victorious. But the deeper they moved into the mountains of North Korea, the more the terrain twisted against them. Roads narrowed into icy trails. Rivers froze into glass. Temperatures plunged far below zero, freezing rifles and stiffening boots until soldiers could barely lift their feet. Vehicles stalled, fuel thickened, faces blistered from the wind. Still, the advance continued. General MacArthur's confidence was absolute. He believed the enemy was on the brink of total destruction. He ordered troops to push harder, spread wider, accelerate the final phase. He believed the Chinese warnings were meaningless. He believed Beijing would never dare intervene. But American soldiers on the ground felt something different. The enemy wasn't fighting, not in force, not in numbers. Small groups resisted, then vanished into the hills. Villages were abandoned too quickly. Ambushes felt like tests, not real attacks. It was as if a shadow was moving around them, as if the war had slipped into the mountains ahead. At night, soldiers heard distant movement in the dark, rhythmic, coordinated, faint. Some reported seeing figures on ridgelines, silhouettes against the moonlight, watching silently. Others found strange footprints in the snow, far too many to belong to a retreating army. Intelligence officers sent urgent reports that something huge was gathering in the wilderness beyond the UN lines. Patrols stumbled upon empty camps still warm, fires recently extinguished. Some units found scraps of rice, Chinese cigarettes, even political pamphlets written in Mandarin. The clues were everywhere, but the belief in victory was stronger than the evidence. As Thanksgiving approached, American units were scattered across hundreds of miles of frozen terrain, stretched thin, isolated, exposed, the 8th Army in the west, the X-Corps in the east. A massive gap between them, covered only by mountains and forests. It was a perfect target, but no one knew yet. To the American command, this was the final march toward triumph. To the Chinese, it was the moment they had waited for. The trap was set, and UN forces were walking deeper into it with every step. The Yalu was close, victory felt inevitable, and just beyond the hills, hidden in ice and shadows, an entire army waited for the world to look the wrong way. The night the mountains woke up. On the night of November 27, 1950, the quiet broke. It happened all at once, fast, silent, overwhelming. American soldiers dug into icy hillsides, heard it before they saw it. A horn, a whistle, a distant shout carried by the wind. Then thousands of boots crunching snow in perfect rhythm. Moments later, the mountains erupted. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese soldiers, the People's Volunteer Army, surged out of the darkness like an avalanche. They moved with terrifying discipline, coordinated across miles of frozen wilderness, hitting American lines from every direction. It was shock in its purest form. The Chinese attacked at night because they owned the night. They used no vehicles, no radios, no visible signatures that American planes could target. They carried supplies on their backs, wrapped rifles in cloth, marched silently through frozen valleys, and when they struck, it felt supernatural. Bugles blared through the dark, signals guiding Chinese units through the chaos. Flashlights flickered from ridge to ridge, coded messages for advancing waves. Human voices echoed across mountains, the war cries of an army that had lived through decades of civil war and famine and fear. American troops had never seen anything like it. One moment they were alone in the cold. The next, they were fighting an enemy they didn't even know was there. Entire units were engulfed before they could radio for help. Machine gun nests fired until their barrels froze. Artillery crews launched shells blindly into the night, hoping to slow the assault. Medics crawled through snow lit only by muzzle flashes, dragging wounded men behind makeshift barricades. Chinese forces moved like water, flowing around defenses, slipping through gaps, appearing where no one expected. Their sheer numbers created the illusion of endless waves, a tide that could not be held back. And the cold made everything worse. Temperatures plunged to -30°C. Blood froze almost instantly. Bandages stiffened. Wounds numbed into silence. Some soldiers died not from bullets but from exposure. rifles frozen to their hands, breath crystallizing in the air. By dawn, the scale of the disaster became clear. UN lines weren't broken. They were gone. Entire regiments disappeared. Roads back south were cut off. Commanders realized they weren't facing a remnant of North Korean forces. They were facing a massive, coordinated, disciplined Chinese army. MacArthur's prediction that China would stay out was shattered in a single night. The war flipped upside down. The victors became the hunted, and the mountains of North Korea became a place no soldier would ever forget. The Chinese had revealed themselves, not as a bluff, not as a rumor, as the force that would redefine the entire war. The collapse of an army. The morning after the Chinese struck, American commanders realized the truth no one had wanted to admit. The UN advance wasn't stalled, it wasn't slowed, it wasn't challenged, it was collapsing. Maps that had shown confident arrows pointing north suddenly meant nothing. Entire divisions were isolated, surrounded, or disappearing into the frozen mountains. Roads that had carried American columns a week earlier were now controlled by Chinese roadblocks. What had been an offensive became a scramble, no longer advance but survive. For the first time in the war, US commanders used a single word over and over: withdraw. But withdrawal didn't mean retreat. Retreat implies order. This was chaos. Radio operators couldn't reach units trapped behind Chinese lines. Pilots flying overhead saw columns of exhausted men marching in the snow, fires burning along hillsides, flares rising desperately from isolated pockets of resistance. Supply trucks stalled in the cold were abandoned and burned. Wounded soldiers froze where they fell, their bodies stiffening into shapes that looked carved from the ice. The Eighth Army in the West experienced the most dramatic collapse. General Walton Walker described it as a rout in slow motion. American units tried to form defensive lines, but Chinese infiltrators slipped behind them, cutting escape routes and ambushing convoys. In the east, the situation was even worse. The Marines near the Chosin Reservoir, proud and disciplined, found themselves surrounded by tens of thousands of Chinese troops. They tried to punch south, only to find the road blocked. They tried to hold their ground, only to face wave after wave of assaults. The cold was the second enemy. Engines froze, tank treads snapped, artillery couldn't fire because the oil inside the guns had turned into sludge. Medical plasma froze solid. Wounds that weren't fatal became fatal because the blood wouldn't flow. Some soldiers fought so long in the cold that their skin turned black from frostbite. Others collapsed from exhaustion, only to have the snow cover them like a burial shroud. American leadership struggled to respond. Washington was stunned. MacArthur, who had promised China would never intervene, now demanded atomic bombs and reinforcements he could not have. The Joint Chiefs realized they were dealing with a disaster, not a setback. The world watched as the superpower that had defeated Hitler now fought to escape annihilation in a remote Asian mountain range. The collapse wasn't just tactical, it was psychological. The illusion of American invincibility shattered in the snow, replaced by a single desperate question: how do we get our men out alive? Frozen hell at Chosin Reservoir. If there is one place where the Korean War carved itself into American memory, it is Chosin. The Chosin Reservoir was not a battlefield. It was a frozen nightmare. Mountains sheared by wind, valleys filled with ice, temperatures dropping to -35 degrees. Breathing felt like inhaling knives. Touching metal with bare hands tore skin away. Rifles misfired unless warmed under armpits. Even the snow felt hostile, dry, sharp, powdery, blowing into eyes like dust. Into this world stepped the U.S. 1st Marine Division, surrounded, outnumbered, outgunned, and cut off from every road leading south. The Chinese called this encirclement. The Marines called it being in a Chinese meat grinder. Attacks came in waves, first probing assaults, then full-scale charges. Chinese soldiers advanced across ridgelines in human formations that seemed endless, their silhouettes lit by moonlight and muzzle flashes. Some carried bugles, directing movements through coded signals that echoed across the mountains like ghostly war cries. Marines fought from frozen foxholes, their fingers stiff, their helmets frosted white. Machine guns jammed from the cold, men cleared them with bare hands, tearing skin, bleeding into the snow. Mortars couldn't be placed on the ground because the plates froze instantly into the ice. There was no warmth, no comfort, no sleep. Even the wounded suffered uniquely. Instead of bleeding out, their blood froze, sealing the wounds and saving their lives, only to doom them to losing limbs later. Medical tents became places of horror and courage. Doctors amputated frostbitten fingers with knives heated over small flames. Medics treated bullet wounds beside men whose faces had turned blue from exposure. And yet, in the madness, the Marines were unbreakable. When asked if they were retreating, one Marine famously replied, "Retreat? Hell, we're just attacking in a different direction." That different direction became one of the greatest fighting withdrawals in military history. They fought mile by mile, blasting through Chinese roadblocks, defending convoys, carrying their dead with them so they would not be left behind. They advanced south through ambush after ambush, calling in air support from frozen hillsides, lighting the night with tracer fire and desperation. At Hagaru, at Udamni, at Toktong Pass, they fought battles so vicious that survivors struggled to describe them decades later. The world watched in awe as the Marines broke out of the encirclement, bloodied, frostbitten, starving, but not defeated. Chosin wasn't victory, it wasn't defeat, it was survival, earned in a place where nature and enemy tried to erase them. And when the Marines finally reached safety, one truth became undeniable: China had changed the war, and America had no choice but to face the consequences. The war America didn't recognize anymore. When the Chinese entered the war, everything changed. Not just the front lines, not just the strategy, but the very nature of the conflict itself. America had gone north, expecting a cleanup operation. Now it faced a second war inside the first, a war with new rules, a new enemy, and a new sense of dread that rippled through every soldier and every briefing in Washington. The momentum reversed almost overnight. UN forces that had marched confidently toward the border suddenly fought merely to survive. Units moved south in broken lines, burned villages behind them to deny shelter to the enemy, and formed makeshift defenses in valleys and hills they had crossed only weeks earlier with optimism. It was as if time rewound, but in nightmare form. New enemies appeared on every ridge. New symbols filled the battlefield, red flags flapping in freezing wind, Chinese political officers shouting commands, captured American gear worn by enemy soldiers who seemed to multiply in the dark. The terrain that once felt open now felt suffocating. Every valley was a funnel for ambush, every hill a sniper nest, every frozen river a graveyard of abandoned vehicles. Air power, once America's strongest advantage, became unreliable. Fog, snowstorms, and sub-zero temperatures grounded planes. Pilots flying close air support could barely see through the blizzards. Jet engines stalled in the cold. The sky, which had made America invincible in WUI, had turned against it. And the Chinese didn't fight like the Germans or the Japanese. They swarmed at night. They infiltrated through gaps in the line. They struck command posts, not just trenches. They cut communications, ambushed convoys, isolated platoons, and disappeared before dawn. American soldiers described the new war with one word: hunted. Every night brought the same chilling pattern: distant bugles, footsteps in the snow, a sudden terrifying explosion of gunfire, then silence, deeper than before, because now the soldiers knew what it meant. The casualty lists grew, the wounded froze as they waited for rescue. Entire companies were reduced to handfuls of survivors, and for the first time, American officers openly admitted what they had whispered for days: "We've underestimated them. We didn't know what we were facing." General MacArthur himself wrote to Washington that a vast new enemy had entered the war, one whose manpower seemed limitless and whose endurance seemed superhuman. But he didn't admit the deeper truth. America had never understood this war, not politically, not geographically, not psychologically. And now that misunderstanding had become a trap, closing around them like the mountains themselves, the soldiers felt it in their bones. This wasn't the war they signed up for. This wasn't the war they were told existed. This was a war reshaped by a mistake, born from arrogance, fueled by miscalculation. And there was no going back. Washington in shock. While soldiers froze in mountains halfway around the world, Washington reeled in a different kind of cold, a political chill that spread through the White House, the Pentagon, and the State Department. Nobody had predicted this. Nobody had prepared for this. And now, nobody wanted to admit responsibility. Daily briefings turned chaotic. Maps changed so fast, analysts couldn't keep up. Generals contradicted each other. Officials whispered in hallways about the worst intelligence failure since Pearl Harbor. MacArthur's assurances that China would not intervene now looked reckless, even delusional. He demanded new troops, new powers, even the option to use nuclear weapons, recommendations that horrified the Truman administration. Behind closed doors, the president and his advisors confronted the truth. The United States had misread China completely. Diplomatic warnings were ignored. Intelligence reports were buried. Voices urging caution were dismissed as weak. And now the bill had arrived. The mood in Washington grew darker with every message from the front. Reports of the Chosin Reservoir massacre, accounts of disappearing battalions, lists of frozen casualties, descriptions of Chinese soldiers overrunning hills by the thousands. The shock rippled outward. Newspapers headlined the disaster. Radio broadcasts described retreats and collapse, words America had not heard in a generation. Families back home stared at photographs of men knee-deep in snow, wrapped in rags, hollow-eyed and frostbitten, nothing like the confident sons they had sent to war. Congress erupted in finger-pointing. Some blamed Truman. Some blamed MacArthur. Some blamed the United Nations. But underneath the political theater was a shared fear. If China could do this in Korea, what could it do next? The Cold War suddenly felt more fragile, more volatile, more dangerous than at any point since 1945. America, the post-war giant, had been punched in the face, and the whole world saw it. Inside the administration, the unthinkable question circulated in private meetings. Should we abandon Korea entirely? The answer came slowly, painfully, through clenched teeth. No, if America retreats, China wins. If America stays, more Americans die. It was a choice without victory, a choice without dignity, a choice forged entirely from mistakes no one wanted to own. Korea had ceased to be a mission. Now it was a dilemma, a burden, an open wound on the geopolitical map, and in that moment, in the panic and humiliation of 1950, the United States began a long, painful reassessment of what it meant to be a superpower. The shock had done its work. The world had changed, and Washington could no longer pretend otherwise. The line that would not move. By early 1951, the war had changed shape yet again. The Chinese offensive had shattered the UN advance, pushed American forces south, and nearly captured Seoul for the second time. But then something unexpected happened. The front hardened. The war stopped being a war of movement. It became a war of positions, a war of trenches, a war of hills, a war of mud, frost, and bleeding inches. American troops dug into frozen earth on ridgelines, whose names would become infamous. Heartbreak Ridge, Bloody Ridge, Old Baldy, Pork Chop Hill. Each hill was just a mound of dirt on a map, but for the men who fought for them, they were hell condensed into coordinates. The fighting changed. Gone were the sweeping movements of 1950. Now the war resembled a smaller, colder World War I. Artillery hammered the ground day and night. Patrols clashed in the dark. Snipers fired from hidden perches. Soldiers advanced yards, not miles, and often gave those yards back the next day. It was a war that consumed lives without changing anything, and it all centered around one place, the 38th parallel, the line that divided North and South Korea, the line that the war started over, the line both sides had bled to redraw, the line that refused to move. By 1952, it became clear to commanders on both sides. No army could break the other without catastrophic losses. The terrain was too brutal, the weather too punishing, the Chinese too numerous, the Americans too entrenched, the Koreans too determined. And so the war settled into a stalemate, a grinding, senseless, relentless deadlock, where men died for hills that had no strategic value, and for positions that would be abandoned days later. For the soldiers, it was torture. They fought through monsoon rains that turned trenches into waist-deep mud. They froze in winter cold that cracked steel and killed exposed skin. They breathed dust in summer heat so thick it coated their lungs. They lived in burrows carved into hillsides, listening to artillery shells whistle overhead and praying that the next one wouldn't land in their bunker. Some men described it as waiting to die but not knowing when. Others said the worst part wasn't fear, it was futility. Back home, the American public grew weary. They had been told it would be a police action, a limited engagement, a containment operation. Now it was a war without direction, without progress, without victory. Negotiations dragged on for 2 years, 2 long, bloody years filled with battles that changed nothing. Each side demanded concessions. Each side refused. Each side lost thousands of young men, while diplomats argued over prisoner exchanges, boundary lines, and political recognition. And through it all, the soldiers waited, and bled, and froze, and watched friends die for hills that would be returned to the enemy during the next negotiation session. In the end, the front barely moved at all. After 3 years of war, the border was almost exactly where it had been in 1950. The war began over a line. It ended over the same line, a line carved not by pens but by bodies. The 38th parallel held, not because it was important, but because no one could move it anymore. The lesson the world forgot. On July 27, 1953, the guns finally fell silent. Not because anyone won, not because anyone surrendered, but because everyone was exhausted. The Korean Armistice Agreement was signed in a simple building at Panmunjom. No cheering crowds, no victory speeches, no celebration, just tired officers, worn across 3 years of misery, putting their names on a document that said, essentially, we couldn't beat each other, so we will stop trying. Korea was left broken, cities reduced to ash, families divided forever, millions dead or displaced. The peninsula became a scar on the map, a reminder of what war truly costs. But the deeper scar lingered inside the United States. America entered Korea with certainty. It left with doubt. It entered believing it understood China. It left realizing it didn't. It entered believing we had prepared it for anything. It left learning that the next war never looks like the last one. It entered believing victory was inevitable. It left understanding that stalemate is sometimes the only outcome. The scars spread beyond soldiers. Korea reshaped American foreign policy for decades. It reinforced the idea of containment. It hardened attitudes toward communism. It intensified nuclear competition. It set the stage for Vietnam, where the same assumptions, the same misreadings, the same arrogance would return on an even larger scale. But perhaps the most haunting lesson of all was this: the war never truly ended. The armistice was not peace, it was a pause. A ceasefire held in place by barbed wire and minefields. A divide that still splits families, languages, governments, and ideologies. To this day, North and South Korea remain technically at war. American troops still stand guard along the DMZ, rifles pointed north. Chinese influence still shapes the region. The same border America bled for in 1950 still defines the geopolitical balance of Asia. The Korean War is often called forgotten, but forgetting it is dangerous, because its lessons are not past, they are present, alive, echoing through every modern crisis where great powers misjudge each other. In Korea, America learned that assumptions can kill, warnings matter, and history punishes those who refuse to see the world clearly. But in the decades since, those lessons faded. And that is why the Korean War remains the conflict the world could not afford to forget, yet did.